Hey everyone, good morning. Thanks again for being here and attending. Just about 5 minutes, then we'll get started. But for anybody watching, hope you're doing well out there, and hope your semester is going well. Just 5 minutes, pretty much. Hey. Cat's running around, so just checking him out over there. Hey there, Kelly. Good to see you. Good morning. Hey. Hey, Drew. Good to see you there. And hey, Eva. How are you? Just about another minute. Hey, Megan. Senna. Everybody here. Good to see everybody. Some street work. Let me just close this glass door. And they bring out the leaf blowers, I think, on Fridays. So, okay, guys, welcome back. It's 9 a.m., so I'm going to get us going. It's a key meeting because we're going to try and finish up the second part of Edmund Gedier's essay, Is Justified True Belief Knowledge? You know what? I have two windows. I thought if I just shut the front, that'd be okay, but there's still some noise from the other, so let me shut the other one too. All right. So for small amount of noise pollution, I guess not much I could do. But okay. So in going back into these notes on epistemology and the theory of knowledge, we took a couple of meetings to just talk about the ancient Greek classical definition of knowledge that came from Socrates and Plato. So, you know, we had to first start by developing a little vocabulary, and we talked about the term proposition, which is the meaning of a sentence. Then we talked about what is truth. That's when whatever the sentence says corresponds, matches the facts of reality. And then we talked about belief, which is just when a subject thinks that a statement is true. Finally, we mentioned, well, two more things. Justification, that's having good reasons or evidence to believe something, and epistemic agent, which is just a being that's capable of having beliefs or knowledge in the first place. So does anybody remember what was the definition of knowledge given by these Greeks that was like so long-standing for thousands of years after that? It's a sort of compilation of three required conditions. And I would just see if you can quickly toss that back at me. Yeah, okay, so justified true belief, exactly. A justified true belief is thought of as knowledge. So first of all, it has to be a proposition that's true. So you can't have knowledge of something that's incorrect or false. Like you can't know that that I was born in Canada or something, because I just wasn't. A person can have a false belief, but you can't have false knowledge. Knowledge, of course, requires success in getting it right. That's why when you fill in answers on tests, you're not credited with knowledge when your information that you report is incorrect. Okay, so knowledge has to be true. Of course, you have to believe it, and also you have to have evidence. So if you just have a belief that's true, but you have no reason to think so, that's kind of just like guessing, not the same thing as knowing. Okay, and so we talked about how in Socrates' discussion, knowledge is more valuable than just having a true belief with not justification. So like he calls that a correct opinion. And he says it's more valuable to have knowledge than to have a correct opinion because knowledge has that additional element of justification. And in his view, justification has the function of preventing the true belief from leaving your mind or escaping from your mind or you forgetting about it. So, you know, justification, he thinks, adds that stability and security to the true belief, sort of like the ropes in this metaphor given of the statues of Daedalus. These mythical statues were so realistic that people thought they would get up and run away if they were not attached to the ground by means of ropes. And so these ropes then serve as kind of like a metaphor for justification, because what justification does is it prevents you from forgetting information that is true or from changing your mind about the true beliefs that you have. So a true belief without the justification is liable to just be forgotten, not retained, or switched up at some point later in time. Okay, so now we started to finally get into the information from Edmund Gedier. And you know that has to follow after the discussion of Socrates, because what Gedier starts off his paper to tell us is that he's out to challenge the classical definition of knowledge. And he wants to demonstrate for us that you could have a justified true belief and still not have knowledge. If that is so, then the definition is not fully satisfying or sufficient. If it's possible to have a justified true belief without having knowledge, then that is not the correct definition of knowledge, because we can imagine examples where the conditions are met and yet knowledge still is not present. So he began the paper, Edmund Gedier, so this is our author for the moment. Edmund Gedier, and his 1963 paper is Justified True Belief Knowledge. Edmund Gedier is Justified True Belief Knowledge. So He starts off the paper by listing the definition of knowledge that he's attempting to analyze and criticize a little bit. And once again, it's just the same definition we've reviewed here, that to know something, a subject will have to match these three conditions. First of all, the proposition is true, the subject believes it, and they are justified in believing it. He states two other alternative formulations of the same definition, but they are not different definitions, they're just stated in different words. So like another version says, S knows that P just in case S accepts P, S has adequate evidence for P, and P is true. But to accept P is to believe it, to have adequate evidence for it is for it to be justified. So just mentioning that in the literature, these three conditions are sometimes mentioned in slightly alternative ways, but they all amount to the same thing. Okay, now after that he has two more preliminary points before he gives us these cases. Okay, so the Gettier cases are really the main point of his essay. The examples are designed so that in the example we see a subject who has a justified true belief, but intuitively that subject still fails to have knowledge. But to get to the statement of the cases, there's still just two more preliminary points that have to be made first. Okay, so one of these points is the following. It is possible to have a justified true belief. It is possible to have a justified false belief. All right, now when we form beliefs and we have justification for forming those beliefs, like good reasons, good evidence, usually that leads to the belief being true, because a belief that's based on good evidence or reasons, that's the whole reason for gaining evidence and reasons, because it improves the probability that a belief based on it is going to be true. But it's not 100% foolproof. Sometimes one can have a justified belief and it's false. Can anybody think of a kind of situation or scenario that might be an example like that? Somebody has a justified belief, so they have good reasons for what they believe. There's actually evidence to support this belief, but it's misleading evidence. It's not actually true what the evidence seems to point out. Can you think of any situation of having a justified but false belief? Just see if you can give me something maybe to work with here in this chat. I know it's not necessarily the full class, but you know, it's a good group, so maybe you have an idea. What could be a justified false belief? It can be a real scenario. It can be an imagined scenario. Religion, you say, Cameron? Well, I don't know, just to be charitable, it's not clear whether religious claims are true or false. I mean, they're debated questions. Certainly there are some who deny or doubt religious claims, but I think it would be a little bit over presumptuous for us to say that we can conclusively determine that those are false. But I understand what you mean. Maybe, Drew, if you have another example, walking into a room and seeing a murder, the murder weapon being in the hand of someone innocent. Okay, well, good. I like your example, Drew. And yeah, has it ever been possible for someone to be convicted of a crime they did not commit? I mean, hopefully it's not the norm, but the exception to the rule, but it's not unprecedented. Of course that has happened at least once. And in such a case, the testimony presented in court seems to indicate that that person is guilty. You know, there may be witnesses, there may be people who give testimony about him having a motive. Maybe he has circumstances that link him to the crime, and therefore a reasonable person, a juror or a judge, could conclude that they did it, but they actually did it. Sometimes people have been framed for a crime. Eva, you say ghosts, thinking you're seeing a ghost, but not realizing it could have another explanation. Sure, I guess that could happen. Suppose someone's in like a spooky house and there's weird noises, but they're just coming from the pipes and stuff, and it sounds as if it's like a haunting presence or voice, and that is their evidence, but it's towards a false conclusion. Yes, that's possible too. Paige, believing someone brings you luck because of a couple of coincidences. Something brings you luck. Yes, that could also definitely be the case. You know, something coincidental happens and a person believes that there's a different causal explanation for it. Okay, so great examples all around, you guys. Just understand, therefore, that sometimes even when you have good reasons and evidence, the belief that you form from them doesn't always 100% of the time turn out to be true. Okay, now one more preliminary point, and the second one is a little more complex, so it'll take just a moment longer to put it down on the board. Sorry, Peach, let me just put you over here. Good kitty. All right, so one more point, and I'm going to clear the board so that I have plenty of room to write it. This next point is like a famous principle in logic and epistemology. It's called the closure principle, and there's no easy way to quickly say it, so I have to first write it, and then I'll try and explain by means of some examples. So it looks a little technical on a first glance, and here's what it says. So it's an if-then, it's a conditional. If some subject S is justified in believing P, and, okay, and P entails Q, and S, the subject, deduces Q from P, then, if all of these things, then in that case, S, the subject, is also justified in believing Q. Okay. So, for us to break this down and correctly understand what it says, we have to look at the term entailment. We need to understand what is for one statement, one proposition to entail another one. Okay, so entailment. So when A entails B, what do you think that means? If one statement entails another one, what could that possibly mean? Like, so for example, you want to, back when you were in high school and you were thinking about going to college, if you wanted to go to Chapman, if you're a student at Chapman, does that entail that you applied to the school? Like, does being a student entail that there was also some application that happened? What do you think about that question? Does the fact that you're watching this lecture entail that you were born? Of course. So by means of these examples given, like if you're driving legally, does that entail that you took the driver's test at some point? Yes. If you're an adult, does that entail that you were born before 2010? Sure. Okay, so like giving you these examples, maybe you can think quickly of what the definition of entailment is. And I'll just try to give you some pieces of the definition. Entailment has to do with two statements or propositions and the relation they have to each other. So we always use entailment in the following way. A entails B for some sentences A and B. I'm your professor in this class, and that entails that I must have graduated college. But me graduating college doesn't necessarily entail that I would be a professor. So what do you think is entailment? If A entails B, then what is the logical relationship between A and B? Let's see if we can just even make a guess. But I think it's actually clear enough if you just contemplate it in a moment. If A entails B, then what is the relation between A and B? Suppose A is I am an American. Okay, well, B is assumed. Okay, good, Drew. Yes, B is assumed on the basis of A being true, right? A implies B. Good, Christopher. And that's basically the idea. So it is whenever A entails B, that means that the truth of A necessitates the truth of B. Okay, so like if I was born in the United States, that entails that I'm a U.S. citizen. And I was born in the United States, so therefore it has to be true that I'm a U.S. citizen. When A entails B, it's not possible for A to be true and B to be false. Okay, so like let's see if you can come up with one entailment. All right. I'll just tell you a fact. I think it's something that's not too surprising, but I was born in the 1980s, so that's the decade that I was born in. Can you tell me anything that's entailed by that fact? If a person like me, for example, was born in the 80s, is there anything that you can think of that entails? Maybe you can even think about math or something, but you can come up with your own example. I was born in the 80s, it's a fact. So what's something that is entailed by that or implied by that? Just to see you working with the concept in one case. To make sure that this is kind of at least somewhat clear, or we could switch up the example, but I'm just trying to get one example on the table. So, well, that there wasn't an iPhone during that time, yes, but that's not so much to do with me. Anything in the 80s is a time period where that didn't exist. That I was born before Google. Okay, so you guys keep referring to relational things, like at the time I was born, something didn't exist. That's true, yes, but something that's logically entailed by me being from the 80s. Let's talk about my age. I'll just get you a little more closer to the example I'm trying to work on. If I was born in the 80s, what does this entail about how old I am today, because it's 2020? A man or a woman or anybody born in the 1980s, we can say if they're alive in 2020, then that entails what? What do you think? Well, just tell me. My 40s? Really? Come on. I'm not in my 40s. No. So do the math again. But if I'm born in the 80s, honestly, I couldn't possibly be 40 unless I was born in 1980 itself. The decade is what I'm talking about. So all you know is that if I was born in the 80s, that I was born sometime in between 1980 and 1989. And therefore, even if I was born on the last day of the 80s, I would have to be over 30 right now, okay? Because this is at least 30 years past 1989, December 31st. So we can say deductively, it's certain that if a man is talking to you today and they were born in the 80s, that you're talking to somebody who's over the age of 30. Okay, so like just entailment, right? Let's see, if I'm older than John and John is older than Sally, then I'm older than Sally. That third statement is entailed by the first two. So it's just like logic, if one thing implies another, we're talking about entailment. So like there's 12 of you watching this lecture right now based on the numbers that we have. If there's 12 of you guys watching, that entails that there's a number greater than 5 of you watching, right? Because it's not possible that there's 12 but less than 5. So anyways, that's how entailment is. Entailment is a logical relationship between two statements. If one entails the second, that means that given that the first is true, the second one must also be true. So now let's come back to this. What this says then is that suppose that someone's justified in believing something. Like you're just justified, you have evidence to believe some statement. And then you notice that the statement or the proposition entails a second one, right? So like my advisor, Sven Berneker, he used this kind of weird example. He says, suppose you were petting a dog, okay? And if you're petting a dog, by all accounts, you would be justified at that point in time in believing that you were doing so, because you would feel the dog's fur, you'd look at it, and you'd see perception, and you'd see it right in front of you. So it would be hard not to say, I've got good evidence that I'm petting a dog. Well, okay, so dogs belong to the category of animals called mammals, giving live birth, and they're warm-blooded like us. So all dogs are mammals. Therefore, a person who pets a dog and believes that they are, and has evidence that they are, and then notices that petting a dog entails petting a mammal, then if they deduce the second proposition from the first, like if they're like, aha, it follows logically from the fact that I'm petting this dog that I am petting a mammal, like they do that little logical inference to the second statement, then in that case, they would also be justified in believing the second statement. So what this is saying is that justification transfers over from one justified belief to a second one that is entailed by it. So let me give you another example, and then we'll move into Getier's famous scenarios. What decade was I born in again? Let's see if we can remember this. It's not a lesson about me. It's just I'm using myself as an example because it's easy. But you remember I said that I was what? Born in which one? The 80s, correct. Now, since I'm born in the 80s, we said that at least one thing that entails. I mean, there's a lot of things that does entail. It entails that I'm older than 20, that I'm older than 15, that I'm older than 25. But, well, we mentioned that it does at least imply that I'm older than 30, right? So, question, are you justified right now in believing that I was born in the 80s? Like, do you have justification for the statement Dr. Vulich was born in the 80s? Is that something that's justified? That's easy to answer. For you, you believe that I'm born in the 80s, but, you know, are you justified in that? That's just a yes or no. Let's see. In the chat, you'll tell me, yeah, okay, good. Huh, do I look too young to be in my 30s? Well, I mean, I'm way past it. But anyways, Jason, you're saying no, but I find that hard to understand because didn't I just tell you that I was born in the 80s? So, I mean, how, Drew, also you. Well, if I told you I was born in the 80s, how could you not be justified? I mean, you're hearing it from the person themselves. So what better evidence could you have? Looking up my birth records or getting video of it or something? I mean, that's not going to happen. So at any rate, testimony, people telling you things, that provides evidence. So if I just told you I was born in the 80s, that's evidence for you. That's the reason you believe it. If anybody asks you later, how do you know that? That's what you're going to say, because he told me one day in the lecture. That's your reason. So anyway, that's a good enough reason. That's evidence. So you're already justified in believing that I would, well, yeah, you can always look for more justification. Does the world exist? Is this all a dream? Are we living in a computer simulation? But anyway, you're justified in believing that, you know, I was born in the 80s. Now, plugging it into this little format. You're the subject. You're justified in believing one statement. Vulich was born in the 80s. Now, you recognize that that implies that I'm older than 30. And you're like, aha, well, I have deduced the second proposition from the first. Since it follows that he is older than 30, I now am also justified in believing that he's older than 30. So whatever evidence that you have, which is good enough to justify you in believing that I was born in the 80s, is likewise the same good evidence that gives you a justification for believing something entailed by that. So all this complex-looking formula is saying is that when you have evidence to believe in one thing, then anything which is logically implied by it, you will also be justified in believing it as well if you perform the deduction from the first statement to the second. So when I'm petting a dog and I think, all dogs are mammals, and that follows, therefore, that I'm petting a mammal, I'm just as well justified in believing the second following proposition as the first. Okay, so they call it the closure principle. I'm not exactly sure why. The term is knowledge is closed under known entailment, and justification is closed under known entailment. So like if you know what a statement entails, then you will also be justified in believing that entailed proposition due to your evidence justifying you in the first one. Okay, so with these two preliminaries, that a person can have a justified false belief, and the closure principle, we now proceed to the Gettier cases. Okay, so this is the real main point of his essay. These cases, these examples or whatever, they are built to show that you could have a justified true belief and still not even have knowledge. And that means that the original definition given by the Greeks, there's something wrong with it, it's incomplete. So Gettier's examples. Now here's the first Gettier case. In the epistemology literature, the work of Gettier in this essay has become so fundamental and important that we kind of just refer to any scenarios which show the possibility of a justified true belief where you don't have knowledge. We call those Gettier cases. In Gettier's original essay, which we're discussing now, there's only two of these cases, but the literature after him has spawned like an almost unlimited variety of spin-offs of these two cases, which I'll talk to you about some of them after we're done. But this is the classic Gettier case 1. So this is the main one that a student of epistemology taking a class like this would be responsible for coming away knowing. Now, like many examples in philosophy, as you guys have already learned, it's fanciful, somewhat unrealistic, but that's not that doesn't matter. The whole point is just to try and display some concepts and ideas for your mind to focus on. So excuse the fact that there's some aspects of it that don't ring true to any kind of realistic scenario you might be in. But some parts of it are kind of normal. So here it is. We're trying to call it Smith and Jones job hunt. All right, Smith and Jones job hunt. So we got a couple of characters in this little scenario. So I'm going to just give you the visuals so that you can kind of remember who they are. Here is Smith. Here is Jones. And the thing that Smith and Jones are doing is they're both applying for a same position at some company. So they're applicants to the position, and let's say they're the two finalists for the job. So they've reached the final stage of interviews, and one of these two men is going to be the person hired for the position. But now, let me tell you something about Smith here. Smith has a belief in his mind, which he's got good reasons to believe. And here's what it is. So I'll put it as like a thought bubble from him. So Smith believes the following statement, the following proposition, that Jones, the other guy, will get the job. And, so there's two parts to his statement here. Jones will get the job, and Jones, the other dude, has 10 coins in his pocket. So there we go. That is a belief that right now Smith has, that Jones will get the job and Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. And let me tell you why he believes that, because he actually is justified to believe that. He has two very solid reasons to believe this. First of all, there is this one other character in this story, and it's the boss. So let's say this is the boss. Earlier in the interview process, the boss had like a moment free. After he had finished interviewing both Smith and Jones, he saw Smith during a private moment with Jones out of the room. And he said, "Hey, Smith, I want to tell you something really quick. Just come over here. Kind of keep it on the down low or whatever. Don't tell anybody. But I'm basically going to end up hiring Jones. I've made my mind up. I'm going to hire Jones, but I haven't made a formal announcement yet. So I want you guys to still kind of wait around until I come back. But I'm sorry to disappoint you. I just made my mind up, and I've chosen Jones instead of you." So, okay, Smith hears this from the boss. And the boss is the one that makes the hiring decision. So Smith has absolutely no reason to doubt that that is true. The boss told him, "I'm hiring Jones." So that's the best evidence he could have that that's true. So he now believes, based on that, Jones will get the job. What about the second part? Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Okay, like this is maybe one of the parts of the scenario that's a little weird, but I'm going to tell you, Smith, for whatever reason, when it was him and Jones after the interviews sitting around in the lobby, Smith looks over at Jones and he says, "Hey, Jones, buddy, I have a weird question. I don't know. I'm just curious. How many coins are there in your pocket right now?" And Jones is like, "How many coins are in my pocket? I'm not sure. Let me see." And Smith is like, "I'll just count them for you. Don't worry about that." So he counts the coins in Jones' pocket. Smith does. Okay, like, you understand me? Smith counts the coins in Jones' pocket. Why? I don't know. He just wants to count them. He wants to know how many there are. So he counts them. And what did he do? He counted 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Thanks. Thank you, Jones. Here you go. I had to know. So now, based on those two experiences, the boss telling Smith, "I'll hire Jones," and Smith taking it upon himself to count the coins in Jones' pocket, he gets to this belief, which is justified. This is the belief. Jones will get the job, and Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Okay. Now, let's call this belief that Smith has here, this justified belief, let's call it D. Smith recognizes something, that D, this statement, entails a very similar statement, which we can call E. So this letter D entails E, and E is very similar to D in terms of what it says, The only difference is that we remove all references to the name of Jones, and instead we replace it with the man who gets the job, just a generic reference to the man who gets the job. And the statement then that is worded slightly differently. It says this: the man who gets the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Okay, so please observe the logical relationship between D and E. This is where that closure principle that I was mentioning just now kind of kicks in. Because what you have to recognize is that D entails E. Right? If D is true, think about it. If D, the statement Jones will get the job and Jones has 10 coins in his pocket, if that's true, then it follows that the man who gets the job has 10 coins in his pocket because that man is Jones and Jones has 10 coins. So since D is already a justified belief for Smith, and because D entails E, the closure principle says that he shall now also be justified in believing what? That's my question for you. Let's see if you can tell me in this chat. Putting these pieces together, he was already justified in believing D. He deduced E from it, and E follows from D. So therefore, according to the closure principle of justification, what do we say about Smith now? Tell me what we've arrived at this point in the presentation of the example. I gave you the fact that Smith is justified in believing D. I told you that D entails E. We talked about the closure principle. So what's the status now of Smith and the proposition E? Let me know. What does the closure principle say about the status of his belief that E? Well, no, sorry. That's part of what E says. But I'm asking you about the status of E. Correct, Christopher. Smith is justified in believing E. Can we all appreciate why? Because he was justified in believing D. Let's take a step back. What's his justification for D? Tell me that. Let's just spill that out really fast. What is the justification, in other words, the evidence that Smith has for thinking that D is true? There are two things that give him a reason to think D is true. They're very precise, specific things. So what are the reasons for him believing D in the first place? You see what D says. It says Jones gets the job, and Jones has 10 coins. So what are the factors that led Smith to believe that? The boss's words and counting the coins himself. Yes, exactly, Jason. So good evidence is backing his belief that D. So the closure principle, if you recall, says that when you have a justified belief in one statement and something else follows from it, then you will also be justified in believing the following on statement because it's implied by the first one. So he deduces E from D. Now he's justified in believing E. Okay, so all of this lead up was just to get you to understand and recognize that Smith, at this point, has justification for believing E. Okay, now, at this point in the scenario, we get like this little plot twist. And that's always a feature of any Gettier case. It seems like in every Gettier case, well, most all the time, there's a situation where the proposition ends up being true, but for a weird reason that was unexpected, for a reason that is unrelated to the evidence that the subject had when they formed the belief. And so that Gettier plot twist type of part of each example, now is where it comes in. So here's what happens next. The boss comes back. The boss comes back from wherever he was taking a break to give them the news about who got hired. And Smith is like looking a little disappointed because he's already got his mind made that he's going to lose this, competition for the job offer. But the boss walks back into the lobby. He walks straight past Jones and he goes towards Smith. Well, we used to have handshakes, but old custom, you got the job, shake the hand. He's walking right past Jones towards Smith and he says, "Hey, Smith, surprise. I'm just such a joker. I kind of like to mess with people, see what their reactions would be. Earlier, when I had a moment with you and I was telling you, just understand I'll hire Jones, I was kidding. I was just playing with you. I kind of wanted to see what your reaction would be. But to be honest with you, The whole time I've been clear in my own mind that I was going to hire you, Smith. So surprise, you're hired. You're the one that I'm hiring, not Jones. So now he is being honest, and that's true. He's hiring Smith. And now Smith, to his surprise, he just looks through his own pocket and just randomly, totally a coincidence, because he did not know this before, but it somehow turns out that Smith, by chance, also has what? In Smith's own pocket. Tell me what you think. This is the little get your plot twist. So surprise, Smith gets the job, not Jones, despite what it seemed like would happen before based on the earlier evidence. It's Smith himself who gets it. And it's just coincidence that Smith also happens to have at that point in time 10 coins in his pocket. Correct, Jason and Megan. So now, come back to Proposition E. Was Smith justified in believing E? Yes, because all the evidence that we talked about, the statement of the boss that he would hire Jones, and the counting of coins in Jones' pocket. So we already have established that Smith was justified in believing E. And he did believe it. Now, is E true in the end? That's my new question for you. E, look at E, consider the situation as I've described it. Does it turn out in the end that E is true? And that's just yes or no. Yes, it is true, correct. What is the reason that it's true? Because who gets the job? It's Smith. And does Smith have 10 coins in his pocket? Also, yes. But now we get to the real result. Even though this is a belief, and Smith had that belief, and he was justified in having that belief. So this is a justified true belief, Proposition E, in this scenario. Despite all of that, do we really say that Smith knows Proposition E? And that is where Gettier believes everyone will have the same universal reaction, that no, Smith doesn't actually know this proposition, even though it is a justified true belief. Because the reason that it turned out to be true is completely unrelated to the evidence that he used to form the belief. And so he's only getting it right due to just random luck and chance. It has nothing to do with the evidence that he used to establish the belief. Therefore, it doesn't strike us as an actual authentic case of knowledge. It's a justified true belief, but it's not knowledge. And if that can happen in a situation like this, then our old classical Greek definition of knowledge that said that knowledge is equal to JTB is false. They're not equivalent, because we can establish examples like this where all of the conditions are satisfied, and yet intuitively our common sense tells us that that's not actually a case of knowledge. Okay? Now there's other Gettier cases too. I want to at least refer to a couple more. But this is like the main one that's the original, OG Gettier case from the man himself, which has spawned innumerably many replicas and facsimiles of this with slight various changes. Let me give you an example of this kind of case that I've actually experienced in real life. Therefore, it's not as weird as this, and it's something maybe a little bit easier to relate to. Sometimes I find that philosophers writing and talking to each other can sometimes forget the fact that, to an ordinary audience, casual readers of philosophy, maybe more realistic cases can sometimes help. Drew, the last part again. Okay, so I'll just talk you through the whole situation again. Smith and Jones are hunting for a job. They both are competing for the job, and they're finalists. Now, after the interviews are done, the boss has a private moment with Smith, and he says to Smith, "Hey, Smith, I will hire Jones. I will not hire you. I will hire Jones." Okay, so Smith takes that as a true claim, and he then believes Jones will get the job. So far, so good? Okay, so he believes Jones will get the jobs. After that, he counts the coins in Jones' own pocket, and he counts them, and there's 10. So now he has two pieces of information. Jones will get the job, and Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. He's justified in believing that for the exact reasons that I just stated. Notice this, that proposition entails this other one. They're very similar statements, but the second one removes the name of Jones and replaces it with the generic title, the man who gets the job. But after all, if Jones gets the job and has 10 coins in his pocket, then it does follow that the man who gets the job has 10 coins in his pocket. So Smith ends up being justified in believing this because It's something he deduces from D. Now, in the end, the boss comes back, walks past Jones, comes to Smith, surprises him, and says, hey, Smith, you get the job, not Jones. Ha, surprise. I'm hiring you, contrary to what I was saying earlier. Smith then discovers that in his own pocket, just randomly, because he was not ever aware of his own coin count in his own pocket, but it turns out by chance, by coincidence, that it's also got 10. So in the end, this statement turns out to be true, because true means that whatever the statement says matches reality. And in reality, Smith gets the job, and Smith has 10 coins in his pocket. So it is true that the man who gets the job has 10 coins in their pocket. So Smith, of course, then had a justified true belief, but it's not knowledge is the point. Because although it's true, it's not true for the reason that he thought that it would be true. He thought that it would be true because of facts concerning Jones. Jones getting the job and Jones having 10 coins in his pocket. He was not aware that he would get the job, nor was he aware that he had 10 coins in his own pocket. So it's just random luck that the belief which he formed, given the evidence that he had, ended up being about something true. Okay, good. Now here's another look at this type of case, which I was trying to say is maybe a little more realistic and something that's really happened to me. So, okay, I drive like a black BMW car, and you see a lot of those cars sometimes in parking lots. When I park over at Chapman, you see a lot of those kind of make and models. And I think this might have even happened at Chapman. But anyway, I was parked in the parking tower structure, and I walked off. I was kind of in a rush, so I go to teach my classes and stuff. Quickly just leaving my car, walked over to Beckman Hall. And then when I get back after teaching, you walk back to your car because you're driving home. And I go to the floor where the car was. And I kind of, for a moment, didn't exactly remember which stall I had parked in. I just had a vague idea that it's on this floor, So I walked up, and I see a black BMW that looks to be mine. Seeing it, remembering that I was on that floor, I believe at that point this following belief. My car is parked in this aisle. My car is parked in this aisle. Now, I believe that. I had reasonable basis to believe that. So let's say that was justified. But as I walked a little closer to that car, I recognized something. That although it looked a lot like mine, it actually wasn't exactly my car, different plates and so on. But what I noticed when I got close enough to it is that 2 cars down in the same aisle was, what do you think? How does the story end? So I walked up to the other car thinking it was mine, believed that my car was in that aisle, came up close, noticed that was not in fact my car, but then 2 cars beyond it in the same aisle, which I had not initially seen, there is my car. Okay, so what was my belief to begin with? That my car is in this aisle. Did it turn out to be true? Yes. Was I justified in believing it? Also, yes. But do you really think that I knew my car was in that aisle? I didn't. I didn't have knowledge of it, even though I had a justified true belief. And here again, we see that the justification that I had didn't connect to the reason that the car actually, that the fact that the proposition was true. My evidence was based on another car, like a decoy that looked like mine. And therefore, it was only kind of coincidental that my car was, in fact, in the same aisle as the decoy car had been. So we can multiply examples like this, where you have a true belief, but the justification that led you to believe it has nothing to do with the real factors that made it true. Here's another Gettier example. There's so many in the literature, and I'm like an epistemology person, so I know like all of them. Take this case, okay? This is actually also mentioned in our book in another essay that I didn't assign to you, but it's the paper by Robert Nozick, it's just called Knowledge. But okay, so suppose that somebody's on a lot of drugs and they're hallucinating, so they're seeing things that aren't there, and they see an elephant. So they see an elephant in their vision, like in front of them, so they believe, based on this powerful hallucination, that there's an elephant in the room, okay? Now, of course, what they're looking at is not an elephant, it's a hallucination. But suppose that in a separate section of the room, behind a partition, which they can't see behind, there actually is a little baby elephant there sleeping, okay? So what was the person's belief, that there's an elephant in this room? And in the case that I'm referring to, is that true? Well, yes, there actually is. But does this person know there's an elephant in the room? No, you'd think not, because although they have a belief, the evidence that's giving them a reason to think this is true is formed from the hallucination elephant, not the real one. So the existence of the true fact that makes the proposition true is unknown to the person, and therefore, although they have a justified true belief, it's just luck that the belief turns out to be true given their evidence. So that's a failure of knowledge, even though there's a JTB. And let's go with another case. You're driving down the road, and you look over to your right from your car, and you see in a field what to all appearances is a barn. So looking at that from your car in your driving position, you immediately form the belief there's a barn in that field. On my right, there's a barn in that field. Okay? Now, if a person goes up close to what you looked at, they will see this, that although that looks like a barn, it's actually not. It's just a wall. It's a wall which is a facade, which from the roadway looks like it's a barn. But if you get up close to it, there's no interior, there's no rooms. It's just one wall, maybe like an art project almost, that gives off the false illusion of being a barn as seen from the roadway. But behind this wall, which drivers on the road cannot see, there actually is what? If you're following the genre of examples that I'm giving you, then you'll be able to tell me. The person from the car sees the facade, believes there's a barn in that field. What they saw was not a barn, but behind the facade, in fact, in the same field, there's what? The barn. Yeah, so let's go back, Drew. Do you think that person knows there's a barn over there in this field? No. But do they have a justified true belief that there's a barn over there? Yes. There is a barn. That's true. They believe it. They think there is. And they have some evidence for thinking that because it looks visually as though there is. So seeing is believing. They see something that looks like a barn. They believe that there is. There's decent reason to believe that. And by the way, it's actually true. It's just that the barn that actually exists in the field is not the source of evidence that they had for forming their belief. So what all these different Gettier cases kind of show us is that the definition the Greeks gave us of knowledge, there's something that's not fully complete about it. Because if you can have a justified true belief and sometimes still not have knowledge, then this definition requires supplementation of some kind. There must be some additional conditions beyond just justification, truth, and belief that are required in order for us to really know. Because these counterexamples seem to point out that even when you have all three of those classical conditions, it's not always knowledge. So what this added condition would have to be would be some kind of anti-luck requirement. Like you have a justified true belief, but it's not just luck that makes this belief turn out to be true, that it has a sort of relevant connection to the evidence that you used. But that is a very, very difficult condition for people to specify and articulate. And the work of epistemologists ever since has been to try and give the missing criteria that will give us a real good definition of knowledge in which no counterexamples like this could be generated. But to this day, there's no consensus view about how to fix the definition of knowledge in such a way that the Gettier cases don't undermine it. There are various different attempts. Some people have their preferred solution. I kind of have mine. But none of them have sort of emerged as the clear winner. And that puts us in a strange position today because it means that the definition of knowledge is yet still to be defined a little. There's something undefined and unclear about it. And if that's true, then it's really trippy because it's like we would think that we know what knowledge is. But knowing what knowledge is still is kind of outside of our grasp. So, I mean, it's sort of like being suspended in air with no tightrope. Like, what is knowledge? We rely on it. It's lying deep at the heart of so many fundamental human concerns and concepts, but we don't have the precise understanding of it yet. Now, just to give you like a quick, really fast taste of what I think is the kind of solution that works, sometimes people try to solve Gettier's problem by saying that it has to be that you still would have had a correct belief in a slightly different version of the situation. And if that is so, then you reliably track the truth. And that's when you have knowledge. The problem with the Gettier examples is that the subject doesn't track the truth. Like, so if the proposition had been false, they still would have believed it. For example, in my car parking example, if my car had been parked on a different aisle, I still would have believed that it was in that aisle because I would have looked at the other car. Or in the barn example, if there hadn't been a barn behind the facade, so in case it were false that there was a barn in that field, the subject still would have believed that there was because they would have seen the facade and still formed the false belief. So some people say that your belief, it can't just be true in this situation. it has to be such that it also would have been true based on your evidence in slightly modified versions of the situation when the proposition was false. But that requires us to specify what these possible worlds are where the situation plays out differently. And for some people, that adds additional problems that are maybe just as bad or worse than the definition of knowledge problem that we're trying to fix. So anyways, guys, that's what we've learned today. We've learned about the Gettier examples, how they seek to demonstrate flaws or imperfections in the classical definition of knowledge. I'll send you guys a little video that summarizes some of this. It's a YouTube clip, and I think it helps. So Monday then, we'll just continue. We'll start reading the work of Descartes. We have a meeting on Descartes, and then after him, we're going to talk about time and the metaphysics of time and the work of Einstein. So we have an interesting week. Coming up next week, we're one essay behind on the class calendar, but just read it in the order that it would have occurred until I tell you what essay has to be deleted later on in the semester. Okay, guys, thanks again. I'll see you then soon. Have a good weekend. I'll be in touch. I'm continuing to finish up your midterms. At most, it could take one more week, but I'll be trying my best to finish them faster than that. Okay, thanks again. Have a great day and a good weekend. Bye.